What's going on, Raptors fans? Long time no see. I'm here to check in with you guys on the eve of the offseason to talk about a pretty contested issue amongst Raptors fans, the issue of direction. What are the Raptors going to do from this point onwards? What direction should we take with the roster? Now, I'm going to talk about what I think is pretty clearly the direction the Raptors want to take, my thoughts on why that's the case, and whether it's a good idea. Um, so you could get into the intricacies of putting a roster together and building a contender, but among the different ways of doing it, there's basically two bigger schools of thought: the rebuilding school of thought and the building from the middle school of thought. So with rebuilding, the emphasis is placed on rostering younger players at the beginning of your rebuild, not being a good team, not particularly caring whether the young players are ready to play now or not. The idea is to give them experience, the ability to grow while being bad, to get high draft picks. This lets you get access to highly touted prospects out of college. And the idea is you're going to get the elite talent at the beginning of your rebuild and fit in the pieces around them throughout the rest of the rebuild on the path towards being a contender. Now, the building from the middle thought process is pretty different. It's obviously usually a general manager is stepping into a team. They're not very good, right? But the idea is to try to just continually get better. So typically teams like this will find themselves being somewhere between like a 4 and an 8 seed at some point, and the issue there is how do you get from that point to being a contender. You're not going to have draft picks, you're probably not going to have a bunch of cap space, but the idea there is that you're essentially getting the fringe pieces around the superstar first and then taking the bigger leap by getting that superstar somehow in the middle of the rebuild. So really the key distinguishing factor here is, when do you get the elite talent? Do you get it at the beginning of the rebuild? Do you get it in the middle of the rebuild / end of the rebuild? And that's really the issue that concerns the Raptors, because we don't have the elite level championship talent. We've had it for 1 year of our existence as a franchise, the year we had Kawhi. So that's really what Raptors fans are interested in. How do we get back to that position? And this is Masai's job from this point going forward. Now, he doesn't have a history with tanking or rebuilding at any point. He stepped into the Denver Nuggets when they had Carmelo. The idea was to trade Carmelo, and you could say trading that kind of a player is a perfect opportunity to tank / rebuild, but he didn't. He traded Carmelo for a bunch of pieces that ended up being a 50-win team for Denver, and they were competitive throughout his tenure there. He came to Toronto. We were a playoff team immediately in year one after trading Rudy Gay, and we continued being a playoff team for a long time. Masai clearly has no history with rebuilding, and what I would say is that the Jakob Poeltl trade is a pretty clear indication that we're not rebuilding. And that's a pretty simple thing to say. I think everybody agrees with that. That's not a contested thing, but you could look at two sides of it. The idea of buying into a late 20s age player, because you're going to re-sign him, right? You're bringing in a player that's in his late 20s that's not planning to rebuild or tank. Separate to that, the idea of trading a first that at that point wasn't even the upcoming first, it was a first in the future. You're trading future first round picks. Yeah, you're not rebuilding or tanking. So I've always found it's interesting that people are like debating what should happen from this point onwards, because what you should be debating is what you prefer. What's going to happen from this point onwards is set in stone. Those moves dictate a very clear path going forward. So with that being the case, I think it's pretty clear that Masai is not a guy who enjoys rebuilding or tanking, and this is a guy that's going to try to continue to get better every opportunity he gets. He's kind of hinted at some of the reasons why he thinks that's a good idea. He emphasizes winning, the value of winning, continually building culture, having players who are experienced in playoff moments. He's referred to those things as valuable in different press conferences. Philosophically, we know what he likes, right? I'm going to kind of present a different angle to why tanking might not be his most ideal way of going forward. So what I have up here is the Eastern Conference lottery teams the teams in the top 5 of the lottery since 2013. So past 10 years of basketball, you could say this is the modern era of basketball. There was a pretty drastic lottery change in 2019, so we don't have quite like enough data to assess if the change in lottery format to essentially not give the worst team such good odds at the first overall pick, there's not enough data to assess that change and how things change. So I chose the last 10 years. I chose the Eastern Conference teams that were in the top 5 lottery odds. So when you're tanking and you're actively bad, not actively losing, but you're just not good because you have young players, right? What you're in control of is being bad enough to be at the top of the lottery. You can't control actually winning the lottery. So the point isn't looking at who was picking high in the draft. You have no control over that. What we should look at is the teams that were in the top 5 of the lottery from the Eastern Conference. So I have this from 2013 to 2020. 2020 being the latest year that you at least have 3 years to assess how a team did after being in that position. And the number beside every team is the 4-year average of wins in the regular season after being in that position. So for the teams in 2020, there's only 3 seasons to look at. But for every other team, I looked at the 4 seasons after that season when they were in the lottery. And the idea there is you're looking at how good they were, the time period that they had that player that they would have got with that draft pick under a rookie contract. So with that being the case, you look at a lot of these teams, they're not good. A lot of these teams over the next 4 years after being in these lottery positions had less than 40 wins as an average. So these teams are consistently still losing teams. Now you have a few exceptions. You have Cleveland in 2013, 48.5 win average. That's largely a product of having LeBron James. You have the Boston Celtics, who that was basically like the last point in which they were actually bad because they did make the most of their high draft picks getting Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. You have the Sixers, who, while they had low numbers for a few years, eventually the process, so to speak, ended. They made a pretty big change in management. They got rid of the guy who was attempting to lose games on purpose and brought in Brian Colangelo, to come in and actually win games. So they brought him in, and he made a bunch of win-now moves. And as you can see, in 2017, they were a team at the top of the lottery. But the 4 years after that, they averaged 48.75 wins. That being said, those are basically the teams that are good, you could say. There's the Sixers, the Cavs, the Celtics, and if you want to consider the Bucks, even though they don't show up here, they were at the top of the lottery and became a contender. So you can look at those 3 teams as the outliers, but the reality is a lot of these teams are really, really bad. The overwhelming trend of teams that are in these situations, they don't do well with the circumstance. Being at the top of the lottery hasn't provided many teams with an advantageous 4 or 5 years going forward. Now, some might say that like the point isn't necessarily to be that bad, but the reality is you don't tank to pick somewhere between 6 and 10. You don't tank to be in the lottery, but not at the top of the lottery. I haven't come across that as a philosophy. The point of tanking is to pick at the top of the draft or do what you can to be high in the lottery so that you have that opportunity. With that being the case, I can understand how someone would say you have to figure out what came first, right? Did the bad team come first, or did the lottery come first? And what I mean by that is, do the bad organizations consistently end up being at this position so their continued losing ways aren't necessarily representative of the circumstance of picking in the lottery? They're just bad teams. So yeah, they were at the top of the lottery, but they stayed bad because they're just bad teams. That's who they are. Is that what comes first, or is being at the top of the lottery not actually a good position, and being in that situation gives way to losing because it's actually bad? And what I would say is that I can't find stats to back this stuff up. I can't give you like hardcore numbers that prove this, but what I would say is I think theoretically the idea of being at the top of the lottery in the East is not a good position to be because of the nature of the Eastern Conference. Me personally, all the years I've watched basketball, I've always looked at the Eastern Conference as a weak conference. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that you look at the 4 or 5 seed, they tend not to be impressive teams. They're okay. Like they're not teams I expect to be contenders whatsoever. They might win a playoff series, maybe two if they're lucky, but they're not that good. I'll look at 6, 7, 8. I tend to look at those teams as bad teams. Not in the sense that like they should have losing records. I just zero chance of them winning a playoff series. Zero chance of them doing anything serious. And not to say that that's always how it works, because of course upsets happen. Of course, sometimes teams find themselves in those seeds for injuries or some reason, but I tend to not look at the Eastern Conference as that good. So for you to be at the bottom of the East, you have to be really, really bad. It's not just that you're a dysfunctional team. You have to basically be barren in terms of your talent. You have to have next to nothing on the roster to be this bad. And I think that's the problem with tanking, is that for it to be worthwhile, draft pick wise, you have to completely gut your team. You have to leave yourself with next to nothing. So, with that being the case, that's the difficult part of building, right? When you're building from that very bottom level, I would say that it's easy to get to from that to being a 6 seed. But to go from that to contention, I think that that's a long, long journey. And there's no guarantee that you'd even be able to achieve that by when that top talent that you drafted at the top of a draft, by the time that person's towards the end of their second deal, that might be when you start to get good. And by that point, does that player still want to stick around? I don't think that this is as good of a practical idea as people tend to paint it out to be. I think theoretically it sounds great to be at the top of the draft and get first access to young players. But in terms of the actual practicality of it, I think it's very hard to do while being at a level where you can jump from to contention, right? I think if a team could find a way to tank while having decent talent, that would be awesome. But I think that's pretty hard to do in the Eastern Conference, because you can win games accidentally, right? Like you can be very average and you'll get a chance to beat the Orlandos and the Charlottes and the Detroits, not in our case, but generally those kind of teams. You'll get the wins against those teams. So I think tanking isn't the best proposition. And I think Masai sees things that way. I don't know if that's exactly what he thinks, but that's my stance on the idea of being really, really bad. So when I look at the Raptors, the idea that they weren't as bad as they could have been during these last couple years, where they had Scotty Barnes and they could have gone the route of basically getting rid of all their older players and just having Scotty Barnes as the focal point on the team and being really bad. I don't necessarily think the fact that we didn't do that is a bad thing, right? When we look at the teams during the same time period that are actually good, and my standard here are the teams that got to the finals, right? These aren't really teams that have a history of tanking to get where they were. Now, the first 6 teams are LeBron teams. The Miami Heat teams, they had Dwayne Wade before they acquired LeBron to become a championship caliber team. They didn't tank. They built from the middle, you could say. Cleveland's an interesting one because, Cleveland wasn't good before they got LeBron. They had a bunch of young talent, a lot of which they traded once they got LeBron. It's a pretty unique case. Like, in theory, you could say Cleveland was a tanking team because they had Kyrie, Andrew Wiggins that turned into Kevin Love, and then LeBron. So, in a way, Kyrie and Wiggins are the 2 young pieces they got from being at the top of the draft that they pivoted into a core that won a championship. But acquiring LeBron, ultimately, that's the big swing that you can't really attribute to tanking. You could say a part of their roster was built through tanking, but it wasn't quite a product of tanking because acquiring LeBron is such a unique thing that's specific to the fact that he's from Cleveland. Then obviously the next team after that is the Raptors, 2019, very clearly a build from the middle team. Miami Heat, Jimmy Butler, build from the middle. Giannis with Milwaukee. Now, they're a team that did appear at the top of the lottery, but that was not relevant to them being contenders. They built their championship team around Giannis, who was picked number 15, Chris Middleton, a second round pick that was, I believe he was acquired in a trade with Brandon Jennings. So that's not tanking. And I think what you could say that their third option, Drew Holiday, was a product of a trade with 3 first round picks. So that's being opportunistic in the trade market. Um, the next team is Boston. Boston here is the example of a team that was actually at the top of the draft, not through necessarily them being bad, because I believe both these picks were from Brooklyn, I believe. But regardless, yeah, they were they at the top? They were at the top of the draft in 2014 once. So yeah, I believe the Brooklyn picks are the picks that got them these players, and yeah, their team was built around talent that was picked at the top of the draft. But that being said, we don't look at Boston as an amazing team, right? Like Boston doesn't come across like the team that's what we're trying to emulate. That's a top tier championship caliber team. No, if anything, Boston is a team we look at and say, hey, they're good. They might not get over the hump with this core. If they're going to get better, they have to trade one of those pieces. With that being said, you could say that the pieces that they drafted are good enough to trade for championship talent. And in that case, they are, I guess, a team you could say that succeeded through the tanking route more than anything else. But that's one team, and they aren't a team that are necessarily on par with some of the other teams here. And then lastly, again, the Miami Heat again. Jimmy Butler, same story. This is a team built through undrafted players that they picked up while being good. So the whole thing I'm trying to get across is that I can understand the Raptors' decision-making and vision for the roster going forward, not by actually looking at the roster, but by looking at Masai Ujiri's personal history, the history of the Eastern Conference. And the last thing I'd like to speak on is ultimately like another thing that allows me to understand it is the history of the Raptors specifically during that first build towards a contending team, right? So look at the first season as the first year Masai Ujiri got to the Raptors, and the last season being the year we won the championship. I got the results of the seasons and then a vibe check at the end for how Raptors fans felt generally at the end of each season, right? 2013-14, the first round loss to the Nets. The vibes were pretty good because we hadn't made the playoffs for a long time prior to that. Took a team that was a veteran team to 7 games, almost won. Vibes were good, right? That was followed with an awful, awful end of the season against the Wizards. Swept. That series was really frustrating. And that was just a terrible time to be a fan. Things felt awful. That was followed by a pretty encouraging season. Got to the Eastern Conference Finals for the first time in the franchise's history. Won 2 games against LeBron. Like, the series was at 2-2. Things felt encouraging. Things felt really good. But again, that good season was followed by 2 really bad seasons in terms of the vibes at the end of the season. Getting swept by LeBron back-to-back seasons. Those seasons felt like shit. So that's the 5 seasons before the championship. 2 of them feeling good and 3 of them feeling terrible. And then obviously the 6th season is the championship season. Things were amazing and things felt amazing. So with this being said, does this mean the fact that we feel terrible about the Raptors right now and the direction that we're heading, does that mean that this is good or expected or a part of the process or something that we should necessarily ignore? No, I'm just saying I understand if the Raptors just don't care, right? Like, if the Raptors, frankly, are going to look at this like, well, this would be like the 4th time you guys have hated how things are going, right? Like, that's understandable for them to kind of just dismiss those feelings and the sentiments towards the Raptors in that regard. So for me personally, like, I'm not necessarily too attached to how I feel for this reason. Like, I don't particularly feel encouraged by the fact that we might run it back next year with the same players. I watched that team a lot. That team had a lot of issues. I think a decent part of it was because of the coaching, or at least the approach to tactics, but the players are still the players. A coach can only do so much. Like, I don't feel great about the situation personally, but I also can understand if that has no bearing on the Raptors' vision. If they have an idea of how they want to go about things, they have a method that our team president has. If there's a method that he's been essentially employing for his whole career, if there's a method that tends to have a better history than the alternatives in the past 10 years in the Eastern Conference. And if there's a method that was employed during our last championship, the build up for our last championship, I can understand if they're just going to push forward despite the fact that people feel terrible about it. So I guess that's my larger point, is that I think the Raptors' direction is clear. It's clear as day what we're doing. We're not going to rebuild. We're probably never going to rebuild and outwardly just be bad on purpose. We're probably always going to try to be better, try to build playoff experience, try to get people accustomed to what it's like to play big games, try to develop players in the context of winning basketball and not just going out there and doing silly things on a basketball court. I think that direction is very clear. It just sucks right now. Like, to be in one of these down years, it really just sucks. But what I would say is that I look at the championship team in 2019 as a team that was built in the image of the lessons that were learned in the really bad years prior to that championship team. So when we got swept by the Wizards, I think the lesson learned there was, hey, perimeter defense is a must come playoff time. Gravis Vasquez, Lou Williams, DeMar DeRozan, these kind of players, can't do it with them. And ultimately, we got rid of basically everybody but DeMar in that context, and ended up constructing a team when we won the championship of basically all 8 people in the rotation could play defense for the most part, right? Norman Powell was probably the weakest defender, and at the time he was like still average, you could say. And then the Cavs losses, right? The 2 sweeps there. The lesson there was, hey, you need championship talent. You need an elite Hall of Fame player. That's how championships are won. You can tinker around the edges. You can get your DeMar Carrolls, your PJ Tuckers, your OG Anunobis. You can get anybody you want. If Lowry and DeRozan are your 1 and 2, you will not win a championship. So, yeah, I think lessons were learned in the bad years in the construction of the first championship team that resulted in how the championship team was built. So I'll look at this and I might say, hey, this season could be looked back as, this past season could be looked back as a season that taught us lessons that go into building the next really good team we have. So, I just understand where the Raptors are going in this situation. I may not like it, and that's why my overarching point is that, yeah, the vision is clear. It just sucks. So I'm going to see what happens. Like I said, I think the Raptors are taking a really, really bold stance that, hey, coaching is the problem. We're going to run these players back. We're going to do it with a new coach, and that's going to result in very different results. That's a really bold claim. That's a really unpopular claim, and I think if it backfires, criticism will be due fairly. And if they're right about it, they deserve a lot of praise and a lot of credit. So we'll see how that turns out. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you guys disagree. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I want to do live streams over the summer to just talk about these type of philosophical things when it comes to building teams and building rosters and all these kind of things. I'd love to have panel-based live streams where we can interact with the chat. We can interact with people that want to speak about these things. So if you're interested in that, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys. I have more videos coming up during the off season, so stay tuned to the channel, and I'll see you guys around. If you like this video and want to support the channel, make sure you're pressing the like button, leaving comments, and subscribing to the channel. These are the kind of interactions that YouTube's algorithm looks for to figure out which content to push to the wider YouTube audience. So the more you guys interact, the more people these videos will get pushed to, the bigger the channel will get, the more content I can give you guys. So make sure that you're pressing the like button, leaving comments, and subscribing to the channel.